everyone, it's Jennifer from Fiberflux. Welcome back to the channel. I'm so glad you're here because today we're going to be making this super cute and very festive little blanket. This is the Spooky Corner to Corner Crochet Throw, and I know you're going to love making it. So this is just a little throw that I kind of stitched up really quickly. It starts from the bottom corner here, works outward and upward, and then we sort of come back in up to the top point. And so it creates these lovely side, like diagonal stripes, okay? And I used fun Halloween colors. That's why it's the Spooky Corner to Corner Throw. But you can really use any colors you like. And this like fluffy yarn like this comes in tons of colors. We're gonna talk about the supplies in just a moment. Now, you can find this pattern free over at the blog. The written pattern. You can get the video tutorial here with me today. We're going to go through this step by step and stitch by stitch. Even if you've never crocheted before, I'm going to show you how to do everything. And also you can get the ad-free PDF over at my Ravelry shop and my Etsy shop. And we also have a really fun Fiberflux Patreon community that you can join our Fiberflux Gold Pattern Club, where I share the month's PDFs over there in that community as well as some sneak peeks here, and it's a really fun place to hang out. So all those places that I mentioned can be found in the links below, and we're gonna learn how to do this step by step and stitch by stitch. Now, before we get started, be sure and hit that subscribe button to get all the latest Fiberflux video updates. It helps the channel so much, and I truly appreciate it. I share videos every week. I share stitch tutorials and full project tutorials like this one. I also share vlogs where I'm just chatting with you about crochet. I do pattern roundups of some of my favorite patterns, and we do giveaways quite frequently as well. So if you haven't subscribed yet, be sure and hit that button, and let's start making this fun little blanket. All right, let's look at our throw blanket a little bit closer. The finished dimensions of the one I made are about 36 inches by 36 inches. So it's just a small little throw blanket. I'm going to show you how to make this bigger and wider if you want to make this into a larger blanket, or you can make it into a smaller blanket. We're going to talk a little bit more about customizing the size of it, but I just wanted a quick little throw personally. So we're going to go through the entire tutorial. We're going to start at the bottom here and work our way upward and outward and create a triangle. Then once we get it to the height and the width that we need, you can see the two side points are here. We're going to start coming in on the sides and move on to part two, coming in until we get to the top point, okay? So we're going to go through the whole tutorial together, step by step and stitch by stitch. We're going to talk about supplies next and then go right into the crochet. For this project, you'll need a pair of scissors, a tapestry needle to weave in any ends. You'll need a tape measure to get the size that you want. We're going to talk a little bit about customizing your throw blanket a little later. And for our hook, we're going to be using a 6.5 millimeter K crochet hook. And then our yarn, we have some really fun festive yarn here. This is called Honey Bunny Candy, and it's their Halloween edition. And you're going to need 720 yards of a super bulky 6 yarn on the yarn weight scale. Now, I'm using Halloween yarn. You can use whatever you want. It's completely up to you. But 720 yards of a number 6 super bulky yarn that recommends the K crochet hook like we talked about. Now, I'm going to be using 3 balls of this orange and 3 balls of the black for like a classic Halloween palette. Now, each one of these has flecks of purple and green, and this one over here has purple and green and orange. So it's a really fun yarn to use. Obviously, you can use any colors you like. It's totally up to you. Okay, so before we get started, I want to talk a little bit about striping. So this requires, because we're going to do a corner to corner square, we need to use half of our yarn for the first part, which is going to make a triangle. This is kind of one that I started so I could show you, but it's going to be like half the blanket. So this will be like the top corner, and then the second part will be the rest of this to finish the square. So right now you'll have a triangle when you start. So it requires a little bit of planning with your yarn because you're going to use half of your yarn to do the first part and half of your yarn to do the other part. The other thing you want to plan is how to do your striping based on the amount of yarn that you have, so you make sure you don't run out before you finish that bottom part of your square, okay? So you can approach this in a couple of different ways, and there are notes on this over at the blog. So in the pattern notes area, you can see some of the strategies that I use when I'm doing a corner to corner blanket like this, right? You have to save half the yarn for the rest of the project, okay? Now, one thing that you can do is just do like a color block effect. So you could do, so see, I had, like I said earlier, I have 3 balls of orange and 3 balls of the black. You could do the entire first half of the blanket in one color and then the entire second half of the blanket in the second color. So you basically, you'll have one solid triangle and then another solid triangle. You could approach it like that. You could also do it so that you are, now let me just arrange these so it gives you a bit of a visual. You could crochet this so you start with 1 ball of yarn, crochet the blanket pattern until you run out of the first ball of yarn, then crochet until you run out of the entire second ball of the yarn, and so forth, okay? And then when you get to the halfway point is when you start part 2. So part 1, part 2. You could do it that way. Now, I wanted to do more of an even striping because you're going to use, if you do it the way I just said, where you use a full ball of yarn, then switch to a second full ball of yarn, this is totally a design choice, but you'll have a lot more of that first ball of yarn. Like, so this whole first part would be mostly the first color. And then as you get to the middle wider areas, your stripes are going to thin out because it's getting wider. If you don't mind that look or you like that look, totally fine, but I just wanted to make you aware. I wanted this blanket to have, this is the third option, I wanted this blanket to have even stripes throughout, okay? So what I'm going to do, as you can see in this little example, I wanted to just show you a little example before we get started on learning how to do it. I did 3 stripes of each color. So you can see 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, and so forth, okay? Now, that makes it a little bit more complicated because you're using these colors in even stripes this way, but as you increase, it's going to use up the balls of yarn at different rates, okay? So that could get a little bit complicated because how do you know when to stop part 1, which you can see here is in progress? How do you know when to start decreasing and have enough yarn left over? That's definitely a legitimate concern when you're doing your stripes this way. So what I do is, this is my strategy. Take 3 balls of yarn, which is half of your yarn. And again, all this is in the pattern notes. You do not have to remember any of this. Just hop over to the blog and you can refer back to it. It's also going to be on the ad-free PDF, these notes. So what I do to make sure I have enough yarn left over, take half of your yarn and you want to take the sleeves, the labels off of all 3 balls of yarn. So I'm just going to do this to show you. Now again, this is just one striping option. You can do the other 2 if this is too much for you. Take the labels off, and what you're going to do is, if you have a scale, weigh half of your yarn with no yarn labels on it. See what the ounces are. Then as you crochet, and you might want to record that. So weigh 3 balls of yarn, no labels, record that weight. I usually do ounces, just as a side note. Then as you're crocheting your piece, what I do is I fold it up and weigh what you have. Once it is the equal amount, or even slightly less, just to give yourself a little wiggle room, once it's equal, 3 balls of unlabeled yarn is equal to the piece that you have so far, then you can start part 2, okay? So once half of your yarn weighs the same as your piece, then you can start part 2, okay? So that's one way you can do it. The reason I do that is because you're going to use, because we're doing, if you look at this, because we're using the yarn colors at different rates. You might run out of orange first and then have lots of the other color, the black, left over. You're going to use your yarn at different rates when you're striping this way. Because we're having more control of the color, you're going to use your yarn up a little bit differently. So before you even start, capture this measurement before you start using yarn from these yarn balls. Because you don't want to use any of it before you weigh it, because you want the true weight of the unused yarn balls, okay? So just to review, weigh half of your yarn without yarn labels, and then once your part 1, your triangle that we're making, weighs equal or slightly less than the 3 yarn balls, then you can switch over and start decreasing to do part 2, okay? So I hope that helps. I hope I didn't complicate things too much, but again, all these notes for all 3 strategies, the color block strategy, the using 1 full ball of yarn before switching to the next stripe strategy, or having equal width stripes throughout your project strategy. All 3 of those are in the pattern notes. So just FYI, I wanted to talk about that a little bit because everybody likes a different look and it can get really complicated and be very confusing knowing when to start decreasing, okay? All right, so like I mentioned before, we're gonna start with the increase, doing that bottom point and create a triangle that will work up and out, okay? So our increase is pretty easy. It's just 3 rows that we're going to learn, and then row 3 is just the row that you'll repeat for the rest of the increase part 1, if you're following along with the written pattern. So what we're going to do to begin is we're going to put a slip knot on our hook. So if you're using a yarn like I am, this has a twist of a thread with these little dots of color, so just make sure they're both intact when you start. You don't want it to split. Okay, so what you want to do to begin is wrap the yarn around your fingers to make a loop, bring the yarn behind the loop, reach in with your hook, bring up a loop and tighten, okay? Then what we're going to do is we're going to chain 6 to begin, okay? So to make a chain, wrap the yarn around the hook and go through the loop. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. Now we are going to be working in rows, but we are going to make a starting ring, okay? It kind of starts that way. It's a little bit unusual, but we're going to go to the farthest chain from our hook, the first chain that we made, and we're going to insert the hook. We're going to create a slip stitch, and we're going to insert the hook into that farthest chain from the hook, bring up a loop. Now bring that loop through the loop already on your hook, and we have our ring. Now I like to just kind of leave this tail alone for now because it helps us later, and I'll show you why. Okay, so let's start row 1. For row 1, what we're going to do is chain 4 to begin. 1, 2, 3, and 4. Now this is going to count as both a double crochet and chain 1 of this row, okay? Then we're going to work 3 double crochets into the center of the ring. To make a double crochet, wrap yarn around hook, insert it into the ring, bring up a loop. You'll have 3 loops on the hook. Wrap yarn around hook, bring it through the first 2 loops, wrap yarn around hook, bring it through the last 2 loops, okay? So that was 1 double crochet and we need 3. So that's 1 and then 2 and 3, just like that. Next, what we'll do is we're going to chain 1 and then we're going to work 1 more double crochet into the center of the ring, okay? So double crochet into the center of the ring, and row 1 is complete. It doesn't look like much at all right now, but it will soon, okay? And remember, I'm not sure what striping sequence you preferred when I talked about it earlier, but I'm going to do 3 rows of the same color. So as we move on to row 2, I'm going to stick with the orange, and we're going to chain 4 for row 2. 1, 2, 3, 4, and we're going to turn our work. Now remember that tail I talked about? I said let's leave that there for now because that will help us. When you turn your work, these corner to corner projects, I like to leave that tail there because that tail points to the bottom of your piece. So kind of right now it looks like a misshapen circle. It doesn't really look like much, but if you keep that tail there for now, you can weave it in later. It will really help you before it really starts to look like a triangle. So I like to leave that in place. Okay, so then what we're going to do, we did our chain 4, is in this first space here, this is a chain 1 space in the written pattern, that first space you come to, we're going to work 3 double crochets into that space. So 1, 2 and 3. Then we're going to work a chain 1. Then we're going to hop over, see this group of 3 double crochets, we're going to hop over that grouping. And in this last space here, this is also a turning chain space, or the last space of the row is in the pattern. We're going to work 3 double crochets into that space. So 1, 2, and 3. And then also in that space, we're going to chain 1 and work 1 more double crochet into that same space, okay? So now you can see row 2 is complete. I'm just straightening things out a little bit here. Row 2 is complete, and it's starting to maybe kind of start to take on a triangle shape, maybe just a little bit, okay? All right, let's start row 3. Row 3 is the row that you'll repeat for the rest of this part 1. So you have a nice big triangle, okay? So for row 3, what we're going to do, once again, chain 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, turn your work. Again, this tail helps. So turn your work. That tail's pointing towards you. You're in the right spot with your positioning. Next, once again, we're going to go in that first space of the row, that chain 1 space, and we're going to work 3 double crochets into that space. So 1, 2, and 3. Then we're going to chain 1. Then we're going to hop over that grouping of 3 double crochets into that next space. See that space there in the middle? And we're going to do the same thing. 3 double crochet, 1, 2, 3. Then we're going to chain 1. And then we're going to hop over that next grouping of 3 double crochets again. And see that last space of the row? We're going to work 3 double crochets into that. So 1, 2, 3. Then chain 1. Then 1 more double crochet into that same space. Okay? So let's look at what we have here. I like to straighten up the sides. Get those edges nice and sharp, and you can see we actually have a triangle now. It turned into a triangle. So like I mentioned before, I am working 3 rows of each color before I switch. Now it's totally up to you when you want to switch colors. I like the 3 rows of each color. So what I'm going to do when you're ready to switch colors, what you're going to do is you're going to cut the yarn. Now there's lots of ways to change colors. It's totally up to you how you want to do it. I like to cut it, fasten it right off, and then just grab the new color and go back in to that last stitch that you worked with your hook. Hook the new yarn on, just like that, and then just tie it right on there, okay? And then what you're going to do for the rest of your project is just repeat row 3 over and over and over again, okay? So when you have a new color, go back into that same stitch, bring up a loop, and then you'll just repeat row 3, okay? Now, you're going to repeat row 3 until your blanket is half the size you want it to be, or you use half of your yarn, whatever comes first and however you're planning it with your yarn. That's what makes this pattern so flexible with the striping options. And also you can easily substitute yarn because you're just making it half the size you want it to be with half of your yarn, okay? So you'll just chain 4. Once again, turn your work. That tail still probably helps a little bit at this point. And then you'll just proceed as normal. You're just using a new color, okay? So we worked 3 double crochets in that first space and so forth, okay? So keep repeating row 3, and when we rejoin, let me just grab my other one. Now this isn't as big as I want it to be, but when we rejoin, we're going to have lots more rows worked, and I'm going to show you how to kind of finish up part 1, and then we'll start bringing it in to create the second part of our square. Okay, so keep repeating row 3 and we'll rejoin in just a minute. Okay, one important thing that I wanted to mention before we start part 2 is that you want to make sure when you work your rows that you make an even number of rows before you start on part 2, okay? So I did 30 rows of mine, which is an even number. So 10 color repeats, so, and 3 rows each. So 10 times 3 is 30. And so now we're ready to move on to part 2. But just make sure you end on an even row. So just wanted to throw that out there. Okay, so I worked part 1 until, so if we look at this, this is the beginnings of square, half of a square now. The bottom edge, if we measure across this bottom edge, so here's the side, the bottom, all the way across until here, it's about 36 inches. So this is like a nice little throw. You can go bigger if you want your throw to be taller and wider. You can keep repeating the rows until it is as wide and tall as you want it to be. But I wanted to just make a little quick throw. Now we're going to start working on part 2. Part 2 is where our triangle here is going to, see, I have to scrunch it a little bit so you can see it, but where it's going to start coming in and make a point this way so that we'll close up the top of our square basically, okay? So I ended up, I mentioned this before, but I did 3 rows of each color. You can change it up, and we did talk a little bit about how to use your yarn. If you're using half your yarn for the first part and half for the second part, okay? Now, we're going to go into the last stitch that we worked, and we're going to tie the new yarn on, similar to what we've been doing before. So I am going to start with the orange. I did 3 of the blacks, and now I'm ready to switch to orange. And I'm going to just go in that last stitch worked, hook the new yarn on, bring it through, and then just tie it right on there, and then we're ready to begin part 2. Okay, so this is just one row that we're going to learn, and we're going to repeat that for the rest of the blanket, okay? So go back into that same stitch where you tied your yarn in and bring up a loop. Then you're going to chain 4. 1, 2, 3, 4, and we're going to turn. I'm just going to, let me just slide this blanket around. And then we're going to skip this first chain 1 space, okay? So it's kind of like at the bottom of where we did that chain 1. So hop over that, and then in the next chain 1 space, what we'll do is we'll work 3 double crochet, 1, 2, and 3, and then chain 1, okay? Just like that. All right. So it's going to mimic the same granny stitch that we've been doing, okay? And we're just going to do that all the way across, okay? So just go in each chain 1 space, all the way across, and work 3 double crochet, 1, 2, and 3, and chain 1, okay? So I'm going to go ahead and work that, and then once we get towards the end of this row, I'll show you how to finish up the row, and then you can just keep on going till your blanket becomes a square instead of a triangle. All right, just coming up to the end of the row here. Now we have, let me just show you before we work into it. We have a grouping of 3 double crochets here in the chain 1 space, and the grouping of 3 double crochets here, and then our turning chain, okay? So in between those groupings, we're going to work 3 double crochet. So 1, 2, and 3, and then chain 1. And then normally in part 1, because we were working outward and upward, we would work 3 double crochets in this turning chain space. But for part 2, as we want to come inward now, we're just going to work in that topmost chain. So go up to the top, find that topmost chain there, and work just 1 double crochet into that, okay? And what you'll start to see, maybe not this first row or even the second row so much, but what you'll start to see is it's going to round off and come in. So if we go back to the beginning of our row here, you can see just maybe ever so slightly it coming in. And then down here at the other end, ever so slightly, if I move my hook, coming in that way, okay? Okay, so what you'll want to do is just keep repeating the row that we just did over and over and over again until your blanket is closing up that top of that square. Okay, just working that last stitch of the row. We have gone all the way to the top until there's just 1 cluster here at the top, okay? So if we open this up. Now again, I made kind of a small little throw. I didn't want anything too big, just something to kind of throw on the back of the sofa to make everything have a Halloween look, but you can obviously make yours bigger. So this is cozy and snuggly. I just really love it. It's very warm. And so what we're going to do is just a little bit of finish work. Now, if you did stripes like me, you'll have lots of ends. I've already woven in most of the ends, and we'll do this last one together. Now, if you just give your yarn end a little bit of a pull, those crumbs will come right off. You can throw them away. It'll save you a lot of aggravation moving forward with them being everywhere. So you can kind of, if you just give it a little tug as you snip, it will control the amount of fluff that you have everywhere. So we're just going to fasten it off. Wrap the yarn around the hook, bring it through the loop. You might have some more crumbs, totally fine. And then we're going to take our needle and just weave in any ends that are left. Okay, I just have one because I've already done mine. But if you did stripes like me, you'll probably have several to deal with. And you want to, whenever you have stripes, you want to stay in the same color area as the end that you're weaving in. So I have a tail here in the black, and I'm going to stay in that section. I'm not going to venture over to the orange because it will show. Okay, and I like to go in one direction and then just like this come back in the other direction. And this fluffy yarn like this is very forgiving for weaving in ends. The plushiness of it like holds it in place. So I really like that about this yarn. It is a little sheddy, but that's the way the yarn kind of behaves, the way it's constructed. It's if you look at it, of a strand of it, it's basically like a piece of thread. All this chenille yarn is like this. But if you look at it, it's kind of like pull it apart. See if I can pull some of this off. It's kind of like you can see, it's like a thread through the middle, and then there's this like fuzzy stuff like woven into the thread. And when you cut it, it kind of unravels it. So that's just kind of comes with the territory of working with this type of yarn. But you know, it's really yields a very cushy, fluffy blanket. Okay, all of our ends are woven in. Our blanket looks great. It's so super festive and fun. And that is how you crochet the spooky corner to corner crochet throw. Thanks so much for watching, and be sure and click on the subscribe button to get all the latest Fiberflux video updates. Thanks again.